Okay, good.
Hi, Ernie.
Good. We got a couple other ones coming in. Great. So, welcome to all of you who are coming in, and those of you who will be watching this on YouTube. What I want to do is tonight, and we won't necessarily be on real long, but first of all, before I start, do you have any pressing questions related to what I presented to you the other night around systems thinking, and particularly archetypes? So is there anything that you want to raise for the good of the order right now, or wait till I take you through a couple little new things, but also kind of a review of what we did on last Tuesday night? So I'm seeing all the mics off, so I guess that is my indicator that you want me to move forward. So I will do that. So anyway, what I want to do is get you to think about something in light of this whole issue of your theories around leadership and the concept of change. So when you did your matrix, putting those things together, looking at the interrelationships to those. But now I'd like to just do a little deeper dive into what the systems thinking is about and how these archetypes particularly will serve you quite well. So when you think about the drivers of change, and what I want you to think about right now is your current reality, because that's what you have. So if you think about your work, what the conditions of your work are, how you function daily, what events take place, what types of activities you're constantly interacting with over a period of 8-9 hours, no matter what it might be. So that's the one thing you're looking at. And then the second thing you're looking at and start to play around with is this whole idea of a sense of the future. And many of us get involved in playing around with this sense of the future when we do things like strategic planning. We look at the vision, we look at the mission statement, we look at the values of what we collectively think about within our organization. So you have the relationship between your current reality and the sense of the future. And then what happens is there's obviously this gap between the two. And if you remember in Sengi's, Schools That Learn, and also in The Necessary Revolution, he shows that picture of the rubber band, to show what's going on there. And that gap is called creative tension. And that gap is what drives us collectively towards working into trying to create new structures or new ideas about the future, or that tension draws our sense of the future back into the current reality. So there is that constant struggle. So if your current reality is so powerful that it draws the energy from the sense of the future, it pulls it closer into the reality, and then there becomes less chance of possibilities of new futures. Whereas if the sense of the future is a shared commitment that is nurtured throughout the entire organization, then that energy starts to draw the current reality closer towards it. Now, they never come together. They're always there. You never reach the total sense of where you want to go from mission, vision, etc. But they're the drivers to help us navigate the current reality. So that is an extremely important concept that you need to keep in mind as a leader. And again, when you think about leadership, it's not just leadership at the top, it's leadership diffused throughout the entire system. So if you're a classroom teacher, one of the things that you're attempting to do with kids is to get them to begin to collectively understand the possibilities of the future, both for themselves as individuals, and then obviously as it relates to the collective group, particularly you do project-based learning, et cetera. So you're trying to draw their present sense of where they are around information towards a broader sense of how they can apply information, how they can use it over time. And as classroom teachers, you know, that can be a big struggle. Same way if you're building principal, if you're superintendent, or if you work outside of education, and you're working, you know, within a business environment, that tension's always there. Same thing at a university level. So that, to me, I think is something that you need to keep in mind. You need to keep focused on as you begin to play around with the idea of change leadership and what it means to you. So pretty straightforward for you. Okay, so, well, I was just, this week, I'm a member of the Society of Organizational Learning. It's a group that, you know, Peter Senge founded many years ago with people like David Stroh, who this book just came out. If you're really interested in this, I strongly suggest you to get a copy of this book because it's a pretty easy read, but it has a lot of follow-up in relationship, particularly to the field book that you have. But what David was talking about, and as I was listening to him, and I had a copy of the book before the webinar, I started thinking about this as some pretty valuable stuff for you guys to begin to think about. And so in looking at this chart that he has put together, I think this hopefully will help you to discriminate between the conventional thinking that goes on inside of organizations and then what it would mean to think systemically within an organization. And again, when last week I gave you that little handout I put together in relationship to the 5 disciplines to look at your organization, I just want you to think about these, and also these slides are available for you to download. If you saw the Zoom link to go in, you saw the slides are there. So when you think about this, as I take you through this, so when you look at a connection between problems and their causes, is obvious, it's easy to fix. So conventional thinking says that, you know, we look at a problem, you know, no matter what that problem is, we have a solution, fix it, let's get it fixed and let's move on. Well, the difference between systems thinking is that what you begin to look at is that the relationship between the problem and their causes are really indirect and they're not obvious. So again, if you think about what we covered last week with the archetypes, they're designed to get you to go into surfacing what is not obvious with whatever problem you're looking at. So that's one distinction. The other one is others, either within or outside of the organization, are the ones that we blame for our problems. And they're the ones that we have to change. So again, kids aren't doing well in school. Obviously, it's the parents' fault. So therefore, you know, we got to work with the parents. We got to get them to understand what their role is, blah, blah, blah. Now, there might be some truth to that, but what I'm saying is our tendency is to look outside. Well, we don't have enough money. Obviously, you blame legislators, we blame, you know, taxpayers, et cetera, instead of moving into systems thinking where we unwittingly create our own problems and have significant control or influence in solving them through changing our behaviors. So again, when you begin to think about if you're going to add new programs into a system, the question becomes, what do we need to get rid of in order to accommodate this emerging need? So that's a different approach, whereas as in conventional thinking is, oh, we got more mandates being laid upon us, blah, 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 blah. But sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. But again, I want you to see the dichotomy between the way, you know, we look at conventional thinking in most organizations versus ST thinking. So policy designed to achieve short-term success also assures long-term success. So as a former superintendent, I can tell you many times school boards have this mentality that they think, our policies will take care of it and it's going to make sure that we're okay in the future. Whereas if the policy is a quick fix, then many times we don't understand the possible unintended consequences, and that they make no difference or make matters worse in the long run. So that's a distinction between the conventional thinking, systems thinking. Then the next one he talks about is, in order to optimize the whole, we must optimize the parts. So our tendency is always, if we have a problem with test scores, or if we have problems related to overall performance, we have a tendency to just dive into one part of the system instead of the idea that we must improve the relationships among the parts. So for example, if you think about some of the new neurosciences that are coming out and looking at this, these concepts, how do they relate to learning of mathematics? And what's the relationship of mathematics to art? What's the relationship to mathematics to science? What's the relationship of mathematics to music? So again, a systems thinker looks for the relationships among the parts as opposed to just focusing on one particular part. And then finally, what conventional thinking does when it's confronted with complex problems is that it aggressively really goes after many independent initiatives all at the same time. And I'm sure you've all been in your work environment where there's constantly coming down, well, we got to deal with this, and then we got to deal with this, then we got to deal with this. Whereas when you look at a systems approach, only a few coordinated changes sustained over time will probably allow for a greater system change to take place and to dissipate a lot of event-based problems. So I think this thing that David put together hopefully will help you in thinking about what this thing called systems thinking is versus what's going on in your own system right now. So any comments, questions, or just some general thoughts about what I've just given you there?
Dr. Gould, how do you get stakeholders to buy into change? And obviously you said that, if I heard you right, you attack the different areas all at the same time. Is that what you're saying?
No, if you look at that chart there,
right.
If you look at that, under conventional thinking, our tendency is to aggressively tackle all of these things simultaneously, independently. Whereas what you need to do is, what a systems thinker will do is only look at a few coordinated changes, interdependent changes, looking at that. If you think about maybe kids are having a lot of problems in mathematics, okay, we're going to keep putting all these new math programs in, but then we put so much time in math programs that it dissipates understanding other content areas, and the unintended consequences is they all go down. So instead of looking at coordinated change, then maybe what we have to understand is we talk to kids, see what's going on with math, but also see how they're perceiving other subject areas that might be important. Does that make sense to you, Ernie?
Yes. Yep. Thank you.
So that's that dichotomy that we're talking about, and it's important for you to think about. And again, what I'm saying to you is that's why these archetypes are kind of nice types of tools that can help you to do a deeper dive into it.
I think that, this is Donna, I think that this chart absolutely summarizes what you were talking about the other day really well. It helps put it all in perspective. I was frantically writing notes and thinking about the unwittingly, the new consequences that the dominoes we kick over so quickly by putting quick fixes in.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I don't know if the cartoon is in, and I use it all the time, but I don't think I've used it with you guys. There's the guy, you used the right word, the dominoes. The guy's sitting in a chair, and he has all the dominoes around him, and he pushes the first one, and they're all falling down. So obviously, eventually, they're going to come around and flatten him in the chair. So yeah, that's good, as you begin to think about it. But at least it gives you what I like about what David did here is that it gives you this dichotomy that goes on inside of our systems that many times they're so tacit. We have no idea of why we're acting the way we are. But now what this starts doing is at least gives you a framework to begin to, play around with it. So now I have another chart for you to look at. And actually what this, Ernie, that question you asked about change, well, this chart then really begins to look at, what the particular, challenges are as it relates to trying to deal with change processes within any organization, whether it be in school, K-12, higher ed, or a business environment. So what he does is again, when you look at this, so you have a challenge. So one of the first challenges, and I think, Ernie, when you ask that question, the first thing that hit my mind is, okay, well, why should we change? So what's the motivation for why we should change? Well, when you use a systems thinking approach, really what it does is, it shows the responsibility for the current reality. It gives us a chance to look at what type of behaviors are really at play under our current reality. So that becomes an important mindset to begin to look at and to explore. And that's why when you do utilize the different types of archetypes, the other chart, remember I showed you, with the patterns of behavior over time, being able to graph those things out. Whereas the characteristic under the conventional approach is that we appeal to desire or fear. So why should we change? Well, there's fear out there. You got to change, because if you don't, and we don't change and make the scores go higher on our kids, you're going to lose your job. Or, in some states, the superintendent can lose their letter of eligibility, or a principal can get fired, etc. So instead of trying to understand why we need to look at this and why we're concerned about kids' performance, the question is, do we look at how we're contributing to it under our own current structures, or do we use the old fear tactic, or, the carrot and the stick? So those are two things to think about. Then what comes into, well, why do we have to collaborate? So what's collaboration? Why should we work together on this? Well, from a systems approach, really it demonstrates, as it says here, how people's current ways of interacting undermine both their individual and collective performance. So when you look at shifting the burden or fixes that fail, the tendency is many times we're not cognizant or aware of how our present behavior actually goes against what we're trying to do. So, but how we deal with collaboration in a conventional sense is we tell people that's what you should do. You got to work together. And so I think from your readings, like in Senge, but more importantly, I think coming out of Heifetz and Linsky et al., they talk about, understanding how to get people to understand the balcony and how to understand the dance floor. So those things come in together. So the other challenge then is focus. Why should we do this? So from a systems point of view is the more you do it and the more you look at it from like the iceberg, as I said to you, what the iceberg does, it gives you leverage points to change the few things that change everything else. So what not are the symptoms that we're trying to look at, but what's the underlying structural issues that if we can make some changes to those, it will have great impact on the system in toto. Whereas what happens under the conventional way, our focus is to tackle many issues, independently, and really we attack the symptoms instead of really getting to the root causes. And I'm sure all of you have experienced anything in your work over time where you think you got the thing solved, but then things get worse. Then you do another quick fix, things get worse again. So as you look at these challenges, and then the last one is learning. So why bother? Why should we bother doing this in the first place? Just let it go. It's like I always used to laugh. I'd say to staff when I was a superintendent, particularly when I would come in, I'd say, well, all you guys, particularly in high school, sitting in a faculty room, I'm sure many of you say, I've seen them come and I've seen them go. So, the idea is for many people, the system nurtures this idea of why bother. Well, from a systems point of view, what you really begin to understand is that our actions do matter and that we do need to learn from the consequences of our actions over time. Whereas in the conventional approach, our tendency is assume that others are at fault and they're the ones that need to learn. So again, if a person's having a lot of behavioral problems in their classroom, and I'll use this as a way of looking at this, the tendency is always to look at the kids, and the kids are problems, families are problems, etc., instead of looking at the structure of maybe how we organize the day, or maybe the way in which we talk to kids, maybe the way in which we do not explain information appropriately. So our tendency is it's them, they're the ones that have to learn, it's never us. So again, this chart now, combined with the other one, gives you a sense of, okay, as I begin to look at this stuff, as I read Senge, as I look at Russell Lakoff in terms of his idealization, the idea of the future in terms of change process, some of these things now begin to make sense. So any comments about this particular chart?
I think that this is Donna again.
Yeah.
I think looking at the focus of using leverage to change the few things that change everything else,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's hard sometimes because we look at all the things that need to be fixed. And so we want to do that real quick fix to address the symptoms. And to get to the root causes, I think will take a little longer than people feel comfortable with. And some of the readings said that you need to slow down just a little bit, figure out what's happening, and then move.
Yep. And that's exactly what a good system thinker does. But the question is why you need to learn to use some of these tools and play around with them is that these tools, when you get people to begin to look at them, automatically gets them to say, oh, I didn't even think about that. Didn't even look at that. So what you're really trying to do with the tools many times is to surface the mental models or the assumptions that people have in their heads about any given situation. And once you can get them out there in an environment that is safe, which then is another issue, is how do you nurture an environment that is trusting, that allows people to feel secure, to say really how they're perceiving things. So that's part of the role of a leader, that they need to do that. Again, you need to look at your own environments right now, whether you are part of a system that there are leaders over you or you are the leader of the system. Then you need to begin to ask yourself, the question is, how do I fit in this? How's my behavior presently in current reality, related to these, no matter what I do in the organization? And that's going to become important, and we'll do a much deeper dive into that next quarter when we get into Otto Scharmer's work around Theory U, because that's where you're really going to begin to understand how to get to a deeper level of who I am as the leader, who is myself and what is my work, which becomes very important questions. So again, there's something for you, to keep adding on to this, as you think this through. So what happens then, as I said to you, and we'll just go over this real quick. It's, as I said, you have the causal loop diagrams. And so there's the reinforcing loop, as we said, that you have an activity, and I'll show you an example of this in a second. And what's important about reinforcing loops is that they're growth loops. So they're either a virtuous cycle where things are really good. So I said to you, the simple way is compound interest. That many times can be a virtuous cycle for many of us. But a vicious cycle can be those that produce behaviors we don't want. So one of the best ones to think about in vicious cycle relates to addiction. That's a good example. Or if you think about weight loss in relationship to a vicious cycle, or if you think about behavioral issues within any organization, they can be many times a vicious cycle. So looking at that, so I'll give you another quick example. So let's just look at a supervisor-supervisee relationship from this point of view. So you have a supervisor, and let's say and this is why these little bubbles in these charts are important. So, okay, this supervisor has the thought process of thinking, these teachers really don't care about this, about what I'm doing, etc. So what happens then, so that's the thought process that's going on. So what happens then in the action is the supervisor acts by making decisions and directing teachers to do things. Or if you're in a business environment, the supervisor directs people to do this, and this is what I want you to do. So that's the first part of this process. But what's important about the process is what's the assumption underlying the supervisor's thought process, and how does it make and influence the behavior. So what happens then is, all right, so they make that. So here's the teacher. So what the teachers are basically saying, we'll just wait to be told what to do. She really doesn't want our input anyway. And think about how many times you've heard that. You might even say that yourself in terms of the organizations you're in. So what happens is when you use these diagrams, and you remember I think the one I gave you was the fixes to fail, or it might be shifting the burden. I don't remember exactly. Remember, it had some open bubbles on it. So those open bubbles are to help people to begin to play around with, okay, what's the thought process going on in here? And then finally, what happens then, the action of the teachers basically is teacher level of participation basically declines. So you have a reinforcing vicious cycle there. But what's more important in terms of this tool, and as you use this and get people to play around with it and use those blank discs or the blank fixes that fail, or the blank shifting the burdens particularly, and then have maybe a group of 4 people sit down as you explain what these things are to them, and then let them play with them to see if they can come up with some, okay, I got one, here's what I was thinking, and work these things out. That's how you get people to start looking at these. So that's that reinforcing loop, because it's a growth model. Then the other one I exposed you to was that fixing a problem. And what really happens here is again, there is a problem, you come up with a fix for it, etc. The mechanical one I used for you was a thermostat, because from a mechanical point of view, that's what a thermostat does, because it's a balancing loop. So what really happens here is that our tendency is we get sucked in to thinking that we can do what's called quick fixes to solve a problem, but the problem is that they do not get to the root cause. All they deal with are the symptoms of what's going on. So, excuse me. So what that looks like then, so looking at, again, I showed you last week, kind of like this, again, looking at that supervisor one that I showed you. So you're looking at performance. That's what supervision's all about. That's what the reinforcing loop is. And those S's they're in the same direction because the outcomes are the same for both. What begins now, we start adding this in from the supervisor's point of view, is that now the hours of work, which again are in the same direction because that's what your job is. What happens then over time is that the energy level then starts dropping and it goes in the opposite direction, and then the performance begins to decline. So that's where a not behavioral, but where a balancing loop comes into play, that, you got, teachers receiving all the supportive behavior, and, there's a lot of work involved in it. The energy levels now are starting to dissipate, my own energy to do this stuff, then it impacts performance levels. So when you, again, look at the grafting aspect of that, basically what you see is a positive reinforcement from the supervisory process. It's really good. But then what happens is over time, it begins to hit that energy drain with a balancing loop. You end up with burnout with both supervisor and possibly teacher or employee, and then you get diminishing returns. And I'm pretty sure all of you have experienced this or could add other ones into this. So again, the best thing to do is look at those handouts that I've given you, play around with them, start, even in your group, as I said, for over the next couple of weeks, play around with those and see how you can get your reflective conversation team maybe to explore a couple of them. Let me see okay. So, before I go into this final slide, any questions, comments up to this point? Do you feel, okay, you know enough about this to begin to play with it?
Yeah, I feel better about it now after seeing, like Donna said, after seeing it on the in the chart format, much better now.
Okay, good. And as I said, it's the old adage, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, man, practice. So the only way you're really going to get to this is you start using it. It becomes a normal way of your own thinking from an individual point of view as you see the complexity of issues that you're dealing with in your job. But then when it really becomes cool is then when you can bring more and more people into the conversation. And as we go through the next 2 quarters in particular, you're going to have opportunity to do that more and more. So as you think about then finally is, okay, so how does this system stuff really enhance it? So basically what I'm going to say to you is that it really helps you to deal change process by really getting people's motivation to increase, by getting to understand, what the environment we're all in. And it also allows you to build collaboration, which as you begin to build genuine collaboration, you're not forcing it upon people, that's where you begin to nurture trust in the system. Because if you do those 2 things, then you focus on common vision and you look at continuous learning throughout the system, what happens over time is people then feel that it's okay to take a risk, because we're not going to get blamed for it, because we're being encouraged to learn. We're being encouraged to try ideas to make the system grow. And that to me is an extremely important concept. Then what else it helps you to do, it allows then really for all members in the organization to begin to see the big picture. Because so many times, particularly in a K-12 environment, elementary teachers, what's so interesting about elementary teachers, they set the whole building block for everybody in the entire system. But many times, secondary people have no idea about that. They've lost sight of it. They've lost sight of the continuation of how we all fit together in the learning process. The same way it's true in universities, and then it's also true in business environments when you look at that. And then it also fosters development of a common agenda, which is extremely important, that we all have input into its development, that we all think that we have part of it. Doesn't mean we all agree on everything, but we come up with a common agenda that at least we all can live. So when you go back to that very first slide where we talked about a shared sense of the future, that's where you begin to generate the creative tension that will pull that current reality closer to it as you go over time. So that's important to think about, and I think it's the last one. And then what this does is it allows for a continuous flow of information through the entire system. That is so critical. Now, obviously, there's some information you can't allow to flow because there's legal ramifications, et cetera. But we're talking about the system of work so that people feel that they have an understanding of what's going on and that they have input to what's going on. People understand that there are certain levels of information, obviously, that you cannot have privy to because legally you can't have it, or it doesn't really pertain to the understanding of the common good for what you're going after. So again, very simple, couple bullet points here really to help you to begin to think about this. And then the last one is really what it does is it creates this shared measurements that support an understanding of the complex interdependence within the system. So we develop metrics that make sense, and they're not standardized in one aspect. What they are is that they are measurements that gives us the information to know that we're moving towards where we want to go in terms of that common agenda. So, and the other side of that measurement aspect of it is that they're highly flexible and they do change as time goes on. I will tell you right now that I do know, like for example, ETS in particular are really doing a lot of research into whole new metric systems for kids that include gamification, virtual reality environments, etc., and assessments that you can design to the, I'm going to just use generalized term, individual learning styles of kids around content area. So there's a whole new emergence of measurements that are going to be coming out of the, locked into the old, I'll use the word 19th, 20th century assessment systems that we're all still under. So these, I think, as you go forward, are going to serve as sort of a baseline for your further development of learning how to understand systems thinking elements into leadership and the change process. And they will become a lot more apparent, particularly when we get into next quarter and really do the deep dive, as I said, into Theory U. So that's just basically what I wanted to give you tonight. And, and it sounds like at least those of you who are here, that this has helped to, clarify, the complexity of last week's information that I got from you. And those of you who will watch this later on, I'm going to say to you as you look at this, and if you do have questions about this, feel free at any time to contact me or to talk to the guys who are here tonight also, because the best learning takes place when you collectively can help each other learn, and then my job becomes, okay, I can give you feedback into where that learning is. So that's it. I don't know. Do you have any parting thoughts or questions or anything, or questions of me?
No.
Okay.
No, thank you very much.
All right. So with that, I am going to stop the recording, and then I will say to all of you good night, and I'll be the last person on the ship.